What would you do if the people smiling at you had already decided who you were before you ever opened your mouth, and worse, had already decided exactly how they planned to break you? Because that was the first thing she noticed about Westbrook High. Not the banners hanging in the hallways. Not the polished smiles painted across trophy case glass. Not the loud confidence of a school obsessed with image. It was the feeling, that quiet, immediate feeling that everyone here had already learned how to judge people in seconds, assign them a place in silence, and punish anyone who didn't fit neatly where they were expected to. And before the first bell had even finished echoing through the building, she already knew one thing with absolute certainty: someone here had already chosen her as a target. If you stay with this story until the end, you'll see the exact moment that decision turns into the biggest mistake they ever make, because what they thought would be another easy humiliation becomes the kind of lesson no one in that school forgets. Her name was Nia Brooks, and she arrived at Westbrook High the way storms usually do, in places too comfortable with calm, quietly enough that no one noticed the pressure change until it was already too late. She wasn't loud. She wasn't eager. She didn't walk into the building trying to impress anyone, and maybe that was the first thing that made people uneasy. Most new students came in wearing their nerves like a second uniform. They over-smiled, over-explained, tried too hard to be liked. Nia did none of that. She moved through the front entrance with the kind of calm that made people look twice without understanding why. Her posture was relaxed, but not uncertain. Her expression was neutral, but not timid. She carried herself like someone who had already learned that attention was rarely harmless and approval was usually conditional. That alone was enough to draw eyes. Westbrook was the kind of school that called itself welcoming because it had learned how to weaponize politeness. Everything about it looked polished from the outside. The hallways were spotless. The students were well dressed. The teachers smiled too quickly. Even the laughter sounded rehearsed in certain corners. It was the kind of place where cruelty didn't usually arrive with shouting. It arrived with grins, with inside jokes, with selective invitations, with humiliation so subtle it could be denied the second anyone called it what it was. And Nia felt that almost instantly. Not because anyone said anything obvious. Because no one had to. She felt it in the glances that lingered just a second too long. In the way conversations lowered when she passed. In the smiles that looked friendly from a distance but never reached the eyes. There was a rhythm to the school, and by lunch she could already tell it had rules no one bothered writing down. Who mattered? Who didn't? Who was admired? Who was tolerated? Who was allowed to take up space without consequence? And though no one had said a word to her yet that could be repeated as open hostility, she already understood something far more important: this was not a place that tested people immediately. It studied them first. That was what made it dangerous. By the middle of her first day, Nia had already been welcomed 3 times by people whose eyes were too sharp to mean it. Complimented twice in ways that felt more like inspection than kindness. Looked over, sized up, and quietly sorted by girls who smiled like they were being generous just by noticing her. None of it was obvious enough to call rude. That was the point. Westbrook had perfected a social language where every insult could be disguised as charm and every threat could be mistaken for friendliness by anyone not paying close attention. But Nia was paying attention. She noticed the pause before certain names were mentioned. The shift in posture when certain girls walked by. The way entire conversations subtly reorganized themselves around one specific group without anyone acknowledging it directly. Power was already visible here. And like all fragile power, it was obsessed with being recognized. She first saw them near the center courtyard just after lunch, the cheer squad. Perfect posture. Perfect hair. Perfect timing. They moved through the school like a performance people had agreed to applaud long before they arrived. They weren't just popular. They were structural. The kind of girls who didn't merely exist inside the school's hierarchy but helped define it. Their laughter carried. Their presence redirected attention. And at the center of them, almost without trying, was the one person everyone else seemed to orbit. The captain. She was beautiful in the polished, practiced way that made people confuse presentation with warmth. Her smile was effortless. Her body language was effortless. Even the way people reacted to her felt rehearsed. She didn't need to demand attention. The room had already learned to offer it. She laughed, and others followed. She paused, and conversations adjusted. She looked at someone too long, and suddenly that person mattered, or disappeared. And when her eyes landed on Nia for the first time, the smile on her face didn't change. But something underneath it did. It lasted less than a second. A glance, a pause, a quick, silent assessment passed between strangers in the span of a breath. But Nia felt it, that moment when being noticed stops feeling neutral and starts feeling like selection. The captain smiled wider, warm, polite, perfect. And in that instant, Nia understood something she wouldn't say out loud until much later. The smile wasn't welcome, it was measurement. By the time the final bell rang, no one had openly challenged her. No one had insulted her directly. No one had done anything obvious enough to justify suspicion. And still, as she walked out of Westbrook High on her very first day, one truth sat quietly and unmistakably in the back of her mind. They had already started. They just hadn't decided how far they were willing to go yet. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Nia had been in enough new places to recognize the difference between curiosity and calculation. Curiosity asks questions. Calculation watches quietly, smiles politely, and waits for the most useful moment to decide what you are. By the second morning at Westbrook, she already knew this school preferred the second. Nothing had happened loudly enough to name, but enough had happened quietly enough to confirm what she had felt the day before. The school wasn't trying to figure her out. It was trying to place her. And those were never the same thing. She arrived early, not because she was eager, but because she preferred empty hallways to crowded ones. Empty spaces told the truth faster. There were fewer performances before people remembered they were being watched. She moved through the front corridor with the same measured calm she had carried on day one, shoulders relaxed, expression unreadable, pace unhurried. The building looked softer in the morning, almost honest before it filled with noise. But even then, she could feel the shape of the place. It was organized, not academically, socially. The kind of order that had little to do with rules and everything to do with permission. By first period, she had already heard her name spoken by people she hadn't met. That was never a good sign. Not loudly, not directly, just the soft kind of repetition that travels through hallways before introductions do. Enough to know she had already become a conversation. Enough to know she was being discussed before she was being known. It didn't bother her, but it confirmed what she needed confirmed. People here liked forming opinions before gathering facts. That made them easier to predict. By lunch, she'd been invited to sit with 3 different groups and declined all of them politely. Not because she was antisocial. Because invitations offered too early are rarely generous. They are usually investigative. Everyone wanted to know something about the new girl. What she was like. Where she came from, how quickly she could be read, how easily she could be shaped. Nia understood the value of silence too well to spend it cheaply. So she smiled when necessary, answered what was required, and gave no one enough to build confidence around their assumptions. That unsettled people more than rudeness would have. Most people know how to respond to insecurity. They know how to read nervousness, overcompensation, defensiveness. But calm without explanation makes people uncomfortable. It denies them easy categories. And Westbrook, Nia was beginning to understand, relied on easy categories more than it relied on truth. That afternoon, she found her first real answer. It came in the form of a clipboard, a polished smile, and a voice sweet enough to sound harmless if you weren't listening carefully. The cheer captain approached her near the gym just before last period, flanked by two girls whose silence made it clear they weren't there as friends. Up close, the captain was exactly what she had appeared to be from a distance: controlled, polished, socially fluent in the kind of way that only comes from years of being rewarded for knowing how to perform authority without ever having to name it. Her smile arrived first. Nia, right. It wasn't a question asked to learn. It was a question asked to establish that she already knew the answer. Nia looked at her. That's right. The captain smiled wider, just enough to suggest warmth without offering any. I'm Madison, cheer captain. The title landed with more intention than the name. Of course it did. Nia nodded once. Nice to meet you. Madison studied her for a second too long. Not openly. Professionally. The way someone evaluates posture, tone, and reaction while pretending they're just being friendly. You should try out, she said. You've got the look. It was meant as a compliment. It landed like an assessment. Nia held her gaze just long enough to let the pause become visible. The look for what? One of the girls beside Madison smiled too quickly. Madison didn't. For the squad, she said smoothly. You'd fit. There it was again. Not encouragement. Placement. Nia almost smiled. Maybe. Madison's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes tightened just slightly. She was used to quicker reactions than that. Gratitude. Excitement. Some sign that her approval had landed the way it was meant to. Nia gave her none of it. No eagerness. No performance. Just enough politeness to remain untouchable. Madison handed her the clipboard. Tryouts are Friday. You should come. Nia took it. Not because she had decided. Because refusing too early tells people where to push harder. Madison's smile returned in full, polished and effortless. Good. I think people will be very interested to see what you can do. The sentence was dressed like encouragement. But it didn't sound like support. It sounded like anticipation. As Madison and the other girls walked away, Nia glanced down at the clipboard in her hands, then back toward the hallway where they had disappeared. And for the first time since arriving at Westbrook, the shape of the problem became clear. This wasn't random attention. It was organized. She hadn't been noticed by accident. She had been selected. And whatever came next had already started before she was invited into it. By the time Friday arrived, Nia already understood that cheer tryouts had very little to do with cheer. At Westbrook, almost everything came disguised as something simpler than it was. Popularity disguised itself as school spirit. Control disguised itself as leadership. Cruelty disguised itself as humor. And now, standing just outside the gym with a clipboard in one hand and half a dozen eyes already measuring her before she stepped inside, Nia could tell this was no different. Tryouts weren't an invitation. They were a test. Not of talent, of usefulness. The gym was louder than the rest of the school, but not less calculated. Music bounced off polished floors. Sneakers squeaked. Laughter carried too sharply in the corners. Girls stretched in neat little clusters, smiling too easily, watching too carefully. On the surface, it looked like every other high school tryout: organized chaos, nervous energy, forced confidence. But underneath it, the same social architecture was already in place. Madison stood near the center like gravity. The other girls orbited her without appearing to. They laughed when she laughed. Shifted when she shifted. Even the atmosphere seemed to reorganize itself around her comfort. And the moment Nia stepped in, she felt it happen again. The room noticed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. Just enough. A glance here. A pause there. A smile held a second too long. The kind of attention that pretends not to be attention at all. Madison spotted her immediately, of course. She crossed the floor with practiced warmth, smile already in place, clipboard tucked under one arm like she owned not just the tryouts but the room itself. You came. It sounded friendly. It landed like confirmation. Nia met her gaze. You asked. Madison laughed softly, just enough for the girls nearest to hear it and mirror it half a second later. I like confidence. Nia said nothing. Madison's smile stayed exactly where it was, but her eyes sharpened by a fraction. She was still searching for a category. Still trying to decide which version of this girl would be easiest to manage. "Let's see what you can do," she said. The tryouts began with introductions, and even those felt staged. Girls gave polished little summaries of themselves, each one somehow sounding less like self-expression and more like a social audition layered inside the official one. Their names, their experience, their confidence, carefully measured and publicly performed. When it was Nia's turn, she gave them the minimum. Nia Brooks. New here. No embellishment. No nervous smile. No effort to entertain. A few girls exchanged glances. Madison noticed. Of course she did. The drills started simple, basic counts, transitions, rhythm checks. Nothing difficult. Not physically. But Nia understood almost immediately that skill wasn't the only thing being judged. Precision mattered, yes. Timing mattered. But so did compliance. So did presentation. So did the willingness to be corrected publicly without resistance and praised selectively without question. That was the real performance. And Madison was directing every second of it. She corrected girls loudly when she wanted the room to notice. Praised them strategically when she wanted loyalty reinforced. She controlled not just the drills, but the temperature of the room, who felt seen, who felt embarrassed, who felt suddenly uncertain. It was subtle enough to pass as leadership if you weren't paying attention. Nia was paying attention. By the second rotation, she noticed something else. The mistakes around her weren't all accidental. A girl cut too close during a transition and clipped her shoulder. Light enough to dismiss. Intentional enough to register. Another stepped late and forced Nia to adjust. A third smiled an apology without looking sorry. Tiny disruptions. Small enough to deny. Frequent enough to form a pattern. There it was. The first real test. Not whether she could perform. Whether she would react. Nia adjusted every time without complaint. No visible irritation. No hesitation. No confrontation. She corrected in motion, kept pace, and gave them nothing back except control. That was not the response they wanted. By the third drill, the room had started to feel it. Not consciously. But enough. The little traps weren't landing the way they were supposed to. The mistakes meant to throw her off were being absorbed too cleanly. The irritation they were trying to pull out of her never surfaced. No embarrassment. No stumble big enough to laugh at. No reaction dramatic enough to build around. And because they couldn't provoke a response, the room lost its script. Madison felt that immediately. Nia saw it in the way her smile started arriving half a second later. In the way her tone sharpened just slightly when giving corrections. In the way she stopped watching the group and started watching one person. That was when Nia knew for certain. This had never been about whether she made the squad. It was about whether she could be managed once she did. By the end of tryouts, Nia had confirmed what she had already suspected. Madison did not lead through confidence. She led through control. And control, Nia knew, was easiest to maintain when no one noticed they were being managed. That was Madison's real talent. Not cheer. Not leadership. Atmosphere. She knew how to shape a room without ever raising her voice. How to make approval feel scarce enough to be valuable. How to make girls compete for scraps of validation and call it belonging. By the time tryouts ended, Nia had seen enough to understand the structure clearly. Madison didn't need to be cruel in obvious ways. She had built something far more efficient than that. A hierarchy where everyone else learned to enforce the rules for her. Which meant Madison almost never had to get her hands dirty. That was what made her dangerous. Results were posted the following Monday. Nia made the squad. Of course she did. The moment she saw her name on the list, she understood two things at once. First, she had performed too well to exclude cleanly. Second, making the team had never been the reward. It was the invitation deeper inside. By third period, congratulations were already finding her in polished little waves. Smiles, compliments, friendly voices carrying just enough volume to make sure they were heard. Girls who hadn't spoken to her all week suddenly eager to be welcoming. Madison arrived last, as expected, with that same effortless warmth she wore like a uniform. "I knew you'd make it." Nia looked at her. "Did you?" Madison smiled. "You're exactly what we needed." Again, it sounded generous. Again, it wasn't. Needed for what, Nia thought, but didn't ask. Madison leaned in just enough to lower her voice without losing the performance of intimacy. "Practice after school. Don't be late." Then she smiled and walked away before the sentence had time to sound like an instruction. That afternoon was Nia's first real practice as part of the team, and the difference between tryouts and membership became obvious within minutes. Tryouts had been observation. This was integration. And integration, she realized quickly, came with conditions. The gym felt different now, not louder, but less careful. The politeness had thinned. Smiles were still present, but no longer polished enough to hide what sat underneath them. She was no longer being evaluated from a distance. She was inside now, which meant the testing could become more specific. Madison ran practice with the same polished control she'd shown at tryouts, but now Nia could see the machinery underneath it more clearly. Every correction had an audience. Every compliment had a purpose. Every assignment was social before it was practical. Who stood where mattered. Who partnered with whom mattered. Who was trusted, interrupted, ignored, or publicly corrected mattered. Nothing here was random. By the second hour, Nia had been, accidentally, assigned the least desirable position twice. Given incomplete instruction once. Corrected publicly for a count she had been taught incorrectly on purpose. Each move small enough to dismiss. Each one deliberate enough to map. And every time it happened, she did the same thing. Adjusted. No visible frustration. No defensive explanation. No reaction. That was when the girls around her started changing. Not all at once, but enough to notice. The first signs were small. A glance exchanged when a setup failed to rattle her. A delayed laugh when a comment didn't land the way it was supposed to. The social rhythm around her began slipping half a beat off script, because humiliation only works cleanly when the target agrees to play their role. Nia wasn't playing hers. By the end of practice, irritation had started to surface around the edges. Not openly, but in the places Madison was usually best at hiding it. Her smile lingered too long. Her tone sharpened too quickly. Her praise for others became slightly louder, slightly more pointed, as if reminding the room who still controlled the temperature. Nia noticed all of it. She also noticed something more important. Madison wasn't studying her anymore. She was adjusting to her. That was the first real shift in power. Small enough to miss. Important enough to matter. When practice finally ended, the other girls filtered out in groups, voices low, laughter returning in scattered pockets. Nia packed her things slowly, not in any rush to leave, when she felt Madison step beside her. "You're hard to read," Madison said, almost casually. Nia zipped her bag. "Maybe." Madison smiled, but this time it came with less polish and more interest. "Most girls are easier by now." There it was. Not friendliness. Frustration. Nia looked at her, calm and unreadable. "I'm not most girls." Madison held her gaze for 1 second too long. Then smiled again. But this time, it looked less like welcome. And more like challenge. By the end of the first week on the squad, Madison had stopped trying to understand Nia and started trying to provoke her. That was how Nia knew she had become a problem. People only shift from observation to irritation when their usual methods stop working. Madison had spent days testing tone, pressure, and social positioning, waiting for Nia to reveal the version of herself that could be categorized, managed, and used. But Nia kept denying her that. No insecurity to exploit. No visible need for approval. No panic. No eagerness. No defensiveness. Nothing unstable enough to pull apart in public. And people like Madison hated what they couldn't predict. By Monday morning, the social atmosphere around Nia had changed just enough to be felt. The smiles were still there, but thinner now. Less polished, more performative. The friendliness had started acquiring edges. Comments came wrapped in sweetness sharp enough to cut if you were meant to hear what was underneath them. Nia heard all of it. She just refused to react to any of it. It started small, exactly the way this kind of thing always does. A compliment from one of Madison's closest friends, delivered loudly enough for others to hear. "You're actually really confident for someone so new." The sentence landed in the air exactly the way it was meant to, pleasant enough to defend, loaded enough to sting. Nia looked at her. "Should I not be?" The girl smiled too fast. A few people nearby went quiet. That was the first crack. Not dramatic, barely visible, but enough to matter. Later, another comment came dressed as humor. A girl adjusting formation laughed lightly and said, "You're lucky Madison's being so patient with you." Again, the trap was simple. Accept the framing, and Madison becomes generous. Reject it emotionally, and Nia becomes difficult. Nia adjusted her stance and answered without looking up. "Then I'm sure she'll survive." A pause followed. Then a laugh, but not the one they had planned. It came from the wrong side of the room. Small, accidental, but real. Nia didn't miss the way Madison's expression changed when she heard it. That was when the atmosphere sharpened. Not openly, but enough. By midweek, the comments had become more coordinated. Less casual, more intentional. Tiny social tests built to force a reaction. Girls speaking over her just slightly too often. Information delivered too late and framed as her mistake. Private jokes made public just enough to exclude. The kind of behavior designed not to wound deeply, but repeatedly. Not enough to report, more than enough to feel. Nia understood the strategy immediately. This was not about one humiliation. It was about erosion. The goal was to make her feel uncertain often enough that eventually she would do the work for them. Second-guess herself. Overreact. Withdraw. Lose social footing. Give them a version of her they could define publicly. But Nia had been trained too well to mistake repetition for power. Pressure only works when it finds something unstable to lean on. That was what Madison still hadn't understood. By Thursday, the rest of the squad had started responding to the shift in ways even they didn't fully realize. Some leaned in harder, sensing permission. Others became quieter, less certain, no longer fully convinced the performance was landing the way it was supposed to. That was how group cruelty always worked. Most people didn't need conviction. They just needed confidence that the room would support them. And slowly, the room was becoming less certain. That made Madison more aggressive. At practice that afternoon, she corrected Nia 3 times in 10 minutes, twice for things other girls had done, once for something that wasn't wrong at all. Her tone stayed polished, but the intent underneath it had sharpened enough that even the room began noticing. Nia noticed something else. Madison was no longer trying to embarrass her. She was trying to make her respond. That meant patience was running out. Near the end of practice, after one more unnecessary correction delivered just loudly enough to draw attention, Madison stepped closer and smiled that polished smile that had long since stopped pretending to be warm. "You know," she said lightly, "for someone so calm, you seem awfully committed to proving something." A few girls nearby fell quiet. There it was. The first direct strike. Not loud. Not enough to sound cruel. Just enough to force a choice. Nia looked at her for a long second, expression unreadable. Then she answered in a voice so calm it made the silence around them feel louder. "No," she said. "I'm just not performing for people who need it." No one moved. No one spoke. The room didn't freeze. It shifted. Small. Immediate. Irreversible. And for the first time since Nia arrived at Westbrook, Madison stopped looking in control. The silence after Nia's words did not last long, but it lasted long enough. Long enough for people to feel it. Long enough for the air in the gym to change shape. Long enough for every girl close enough to hear the exchange to realize something had just happened that the room was not prepared for. Not a fight. Something worse. A disruption. Because Madison's authority had never depended on force. It depended on rhythm, predictability, the unspoken confidence that every interaction would bend back toward her control. Nia had done something no one else had done in a very long time. She had interrupted the rhythm. And the most dangerous part was not what she said. It was how easily she said it. No anger. No raised voice. No visible frustration. No emotional spill for Madison to point at and reframe. Just precision. That was what the room felt. And once people feel precision, they begin noticing how much of everything else around them has been performance. Madison smiled almost immediately. Too quickly. Too perfectly. The kind of smile people use when they know they have been challenged and need the room to believe they haven't noticed. She gave a short laugh. Light. Controlled. Relax, she said, glancing around just enough to invite the room to treat it like a joke. It's not that serious. There it was. The oldest recovery move in the room. Escalate privately. Minimize publicly. Turn pressure into humor the moment it stops working. A few girls laughed, but not enough of them. And not naturally. Nia saw it happen in real time. The hesitation, the delayed reactions, the tiny social lag that appears when people are no longer fully sure which side of a moment is safer. Madison saw it too. That was the first time Nia recognized something real underneath all that polish. Not anger. Concern. By the time practice ended, the atmosphere had changed in ways subtle enough to deny but too visible to miss. Conversations reorganized themselves differently. The girls closest to Madison stayed close, but their laughter came a fraction later now, as if checking the room before committing. Others had grown quieter, less eager, less automatic. No one said anything directly. No one needed to. Doubt had entered the structure. And doubt, once introduced into hierarchy, spreads faster than confidence ever does. Nia felt it in the way people looked at her while pretending not to. Not warmer, not kinder, just less certain. She was no longer being treated like a role everyone understood. She had become harder to place. That was enough to make people nervous. The next morning confirmed it. By first period, the school had already done what schools always do. It had turned a private moment into public tension. Not as fact, as rumor, as implication. As fragments passed through hallways and reshaped by whoever told them. Nia didn't need to hear the details to know it was moving. She could feel it in the glances. In the way people looked at her now, not with immediate judgment, but with interest sharpened by uncertainty. Something had shifted, and Westbrook had noticed. Madison responded the way people like Madison always do when control begins slipping. She widened the performance. She became warmer in public. Kinder. Louder. More generous where people could see it. She greeted Nia in the hallway with polished enthusiasm. Praised her in front of others. Smiled more brightly. Spoke more sweetly. It was almost impressive. To anyone outside it, Madison now looked patient. Inclusive. Mature. Which meant whatever came next would not happen in public first. It would happen carefully. Privately. That afternoon at practice, the room felt wrong before anything happened. Too polished, too easy, too smooth in the way spaces become when tension has been temporarily hidden instead of resolved. Madison was in a better mood than she should have been. That alone told Nia enough. People like Madison did not recover control by calming down. They recovered it by changing tactics. Practice ran cleaner than usual. Too clean. No sharp comments. No obvious corrections. No small humiliations slipped into routine. Even the girls around Madison seemed more relaxed, their confidence returning now that the performance had found its footing again. That was what made it obvious. This wasn't peace. It was setup. And when people stop trying to provoke you openly, it usually means they've decided to become more creative. Nia had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous shift in any conflict is not escalation. It is refinement. Loud hostility is easy to recognize. It announces itself. It gives you shape, timing, direction. But when people stop being obvious, it usually means they've stopped trying to win emotionally and started trying to win strategically. That was what Madison was doing now. She had stopped pushing in ways the room could feel. Now she was building something quieter. And quieter, Nia knew, was usually where the real damage was planned. For the next several days, the tension at practice almost disappeared. Not completely. Just enough to become suspicious. Madison was warm again, controlled, publicly gracious. She praised Nia when others were listening. Included her in conversations just enough to create the appearance of acceptance. The sharper girls around her followed suit, smiling more easily now, softening their edges, stepping back from the obvious little cuts they had been using before. To anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like the problem had resolved itself. Nia understood better. Cruel people rarely stop when something fails. They adapt. And adaptation always comes dressed like improvement before it reveals itself as intent. By Wednesday, even some of the girls on the squad seemed to relax around her. Not fully, but enough to suggest Madison had successfully reset the room. The atmosphere had smoothed over. Laughter returned. Practice moved with fewer interruptions. The tension that had once been sharp and visible had been tucked neatly beneath routine. That was what made everyone else lower their guard. Nia didn't. Because peace that arrives too quickly after resistance is almost never peace. It is repositioning. The first sign came in the form of kindness. The most useful weapon in controlled spaces. A girl named Tessa, one of Madison's quieter orbiters, friendly enough to seem harmless, invisible enough to avoid suspicion, approached Nia after practice with an easy smile and a casual tone. "A few of us are grabbing something after school tomorrow," she said. "You should come." The invitation landed softly, warm, casual, perfectly normal. Too normal. Nia looked at her. "Why?" Tessa laughed, just enough to make the question seem unnecessarily serious. "Because you're on the squad." Simple, reasonable, hard to refuse without seeming difficult. Nia studied her for half a second longer than most people would have tolerated. Then nodded once. "Maybe." Tessa smiled. "Good." Madison thought it'd be nice. There it was. Not invitation. Design. Nia said nothing. By the next afternoon, 3 more girls had casually mentioned it, each one with the same easy tone, the same polished normalcy, the same subtle insistence. Too coordinated to be spontaneous. Too casual to challenge directly. A social invitation. That was all it was supposed to look like. And maybe that was all it looked like to everyone else. But Nia understood structure too well to miss what it actually was. A group setting. Controlled social pressure. No teachers. No formal rules. No visible authority. A better room for testing. That evening, she arrived exactly 5 minutes late. Not enough to be rude. Enough to enter after the atmosphere had already formed. The restaurant was loud in the way group places usually are after school, music just high enough to flatten conversation, booths crowded with students performing ease, laughter moving too fast to be fully real. Madison had chosen the place carefully. Public enough to appear harmless. Social enough to become useful. The moment Nia walked in, she felt it. Not hostility. Arrangement. Seats already chosen. Dynamics already set. Madison at the center. Space waiting where they wanted her. Every social trap begins with placement. Nia smiled to herself, almost imperceptibly. Then sat exactly where they expected her to. Because sometimes the easiest way to understand a trap is to let it close just enough to show you how it works. The first 10 minutes were almost convincing. That was what made them effective. The girls laughed easily, spoke in polished turns, and performed the kind of effortless friendliness that only works when everyone involved has rehearsed it just enough to make it feel natural. Food arrived, drinks were ordered, stories were exchanged with that practiced rhythm group hierarchies rely on. Just enough inclusion to create comfort, just enough distance to preserve structure. To anyone watching from another table, it would have looked harmless. Maybe even warm. That was the point. Madison sat at the center of it all, steering the conversation without ever appearing to. She asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, redirected attention so smoothly it barely registered as control. She was good at this. Better than most people would ever realize. Not because she was charismatic, because she understood how to make people feel included while deciding exactly how much space they were allowed to occupy. Nia let the rhythm play out. She answered what was asked, smiled when necessary, gave them just enough to keep the performance moving. Nothing more. And slowly, exactly as she expected, the tone began to shift. Not abruptly, carefully. Madison started first. So, she said, leaning back just enough to sound casual, what was your old school like? Simple question, easy answer. But Nia heard what sat underneath it. Origin, status, context. The room was not asking where she came from. It was asking what category she belonged to before she arrived here. Nia took a sip of her drink. Different. A few of the girls laughed lightly. Madison smiled. That sounds ominous. Nia set the glass down. It wasn't. The answer gave them nothing. Madison adjusted. Do you miss it? Again, simple on the surface. A probe underneath. Nia met her eyes. Not enough to go back. That drew a few more glances. Not because the answer was dramatic. Because it closed the door they wanted open. The conversation moved on, but the energy had changed. The questions became softer, more personal, less about school, more about her, where she lived, who she lived with, why she moved, whether she'd always been this quiet, whether she was shy, whether she was always this serious. Every question came dressed like curiosity. Every one of them was extraction. Nia answered the same way she had all week. Politely, briefly, without giving them enough to build confidence around what they thought they were learning. And little by little, the room began to feel it. Madison was not getting what she wanted. That was when the warmth started thinning. Not disappearing, sharpening. A girl across from Nia tilted her head and smiled. You're kind of hard to get close to. The table went quieter by instinct. Not silent, listening. Nia looked at her. That depends on intent. The smile on the girl's face tightened. Someone laughed too late. Madison stepped in smoothly, smile already prepared. She means you're mysterious. No, Nia thought. She means access is harder than expected. But she let Madison repair the moment. That was useful too. Then came the first real move. Madison smiled into her drink and said, lightly enough to sound playful, honestly, I think everyone's just trying to figure out whether you're guarded, or whether you think you're better than everyone. There it was. Not insult. Positioning. A social accusation disguised as humor. Elegant enough to deny. Sharp enough to isolate. The kind of sentence designed to force immediate self-defense. Because once someone starts defending their character in a room like this, they've already surrendered the frame. Several girls went still. Not obviously. But enough. They were waiting. Not for her answer. For her reaction. Nia looked at Madison for a long moment, calm enough to make the silence around the table begin pressing on everyone else first. Then she answered, I think people who need quick access to strangers usually aren't looking for honesty. No one spoke. The silence this time was different. Heavier. No easy laugh followed. No quick recovery arrived. Because for the first time all evening, Madison's control over the room didn't bend. It stalled. Just for a second. But a second was enough. Madison smiled. Too quickly. Again. Wow, she said with a soft laugh. You really do make everything intense. And there it was. Deflection. Minimize the hit. Reframe the speaker. Return the room to safety. The move was smooth, But this time, Nia noticed something more important than the tactic itself. A few girls at the table didn't laugh. One looked down, another looked away, and one, quiet, observant, seated near the end, watched Madison instead of Nia. That was the first real fracture. Not conflict, not confrontation, something more useful. Witness. Madison felt it before she acknowledged it. Not in anything anyone said. In what wasn't happening anymore. The easy rhythm of the table had shifted, and once a group loses its rhythm, even slightly, the people who depend on control feel it immediately. Laughter no longer arrived on cue. Reactions were no longer automatic. The small social shortcuts that usually kept everything smooth had started to hesitate. And hesitation is where control begins to slip. Madison recovered quickly, but not perfectly. She redirected the conversation with practiced ease, pushing it back toward safer topics, school events, routines, shared complaints about classes. Anything that didn't require emotional exposure. Anything that didn't require her to compete directly with what had just been said. The table followed, mostly, but not completely. And that, not completely, mattered more than anything else. Nia stayed quiet for most of it. Not withdrawn, present, observing. She could see the adjustments now happening in real time. The subtle recalibration of who was speaking more carefully. Who was laughing slightly less. Who was watching Madison instead of participating with her. This was what group systems did when their center of gravity was questioned. They tried to stabilize themselves without admitting they were unstable. But instability doesn't disappear just because it's ignored. It spreads differently. By the time they were finishing, the energy at the table had shifted from performative ease into something more restrained. Not tension exactly. Not conflict yet. But awareness. The kind that makes people slightly more careful than they were at the start of the night. Careful is the first step away from certainty. Madison stood first, naturally reclaiming physical control of the group. Same time next week, she said lightly, as if nothing had changed at all. A few girls nodded quickly. One hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second. But Madison saw it. So did Nia. That was enough. As the group began to leave, the conversations broke into smaller clusters, but none of them fully returned to how they had been earlier. Even the laughter felt slightly reassigned, moving away from central confidence and into safer, less committed pockets. Madison walked beside Nia as they exited. Just the two of them for a moment. The others slightly ahead, or slightly behind, always arranged, always intentional. "You're interesting," Madison said casually, breaking the silence. Nia looked ahead. That's usually what people say when they can't decide what they think. Madison smiled, but it didn't land the same way it had before. "Or when they think you're hiding something," she replied. Nia paused for half a step, then continued walking. "Everyone's hiding something." That answer should have closed the conversation. Instead, it sharpened it. Madison turned her head slightly. "Some people are just better at it." There it was again. Not accusation. Testing. Nia met her gaze briefly. Or they just don't feel the need to perform everything they are. For a fraction of a second, Madison didn't respond. It wasn't long enough for anyone else to notice. But Nia did. That pause wasn't confusion. It was recalculation. And recalculation only happens when the original strategy stops producing predictable outcomes. When they reached the parking area, the group split naturally into cars, small clusters forming and dissolving in practiced patterns. Madison said goodbye to everyone with her usual warmth, each farewell perfectly timed, perfectly delivered. But when she looked at Nia, something lingered just a moment too long behind her expression. Not dislike. Not friendliness. Assessment that had become slightly less confident than before. "See you Monday," Madison said. Nia nodded once. "Sure." Madison smiled and turned away. But this time, she didn't leave immediately. She watched Nia for a second longer than she needed to. And Nia noticed something she had not seen clearly before. Madison wasn't just managing the squad. She was defending it, against something she couldn't fully define yet. And that made her more dangerous than before. Because control is always most unstable. When the person holding it starts to believe it might not be enough anymore. By Monday morning, Westbrook High no longer felt like it was simply reacting to Nia. It felt like it was organizing itself around her. Not openly, not in any way that could be pointed to directly, but in the subtle mechanics of social behavior, in the way people adjusted their tone when she passed, in the way conversations paused for half a second longer before resuming. Something had shifted from casual curiosity into structured attention. And structured attention always becomes pressure. Nia noticed it in the hallway first. Not because anyone confronted her, but because no one did. The silence around her had changed texture. It was no longer indifferent. It was aware. Students who previously looked through her now looked around her. As if acknowledging her presence required more energy than they were willing to spend unless necessary. That was new. By second period, the first version of the story had already begun circulating. It didn't matter what the story was yet. It mattered that there was one. At Westbrook, stories were currency. Not because they were true, but because they defined placement. Who mattered enough to be discussed? Who was interesting enough to be analyzed? Who was important enough to be misunderstood? And Nia had become all three. She heard fragments of it between classes. She talked back to Madison. No, she didn't, she just said something weird. She's kind of intense. She thinks she's above everyone. None of it was accurate. All of it was useful. Because accuracy was never the goal. Narrative was. By lunchtime, Madison had already begun repairing control. She always repaired in public. That was part of her strength. Not correction through confrontation, but correction through performance. She approached Nia at the edge of the cafeteria with her usual timing, perfectly placed where enough people could see, but not so many that it looked staged. Nia, she said warmly, as if nothing had changed at all, come sit with us. The invitation was not casual. It was strategic, a reset attempt, a public reabsorption. Nia understood immediately. She followed anyway. Because refusing too early tells people you're building resistance. Accepting lets you see how they try to contain it. The table was already arranged before she arrived. Not formally, socially. Seats slightly adjusted. Gaps intentionally placed. Proximity carefully measured. Madison at the center again, of course. The others arranged around her like extensions of her tone. Nia sat where she was guided to sit without comment. The conversation restarted quickly. Too quickly. As if the silence needed to be overridden. Madison laughed softly at something someone said, then turned toward Nia. So, she said, smiling, how was your weekend? Simple question. Loaded context. The table waited. Nia answered calmly. Quiet. A few light laughs followed. Madison nodded. That sounds like you. It wasn't meant as a compliment. It was meant as definition. Nia didn't correct it. That unsettled Madison more than correction would have. The conversation moved forward, but now it carried a second layer underneath it. One that wasn't spoken but constantly present. Every comment had dual meaning. Every smile had a possible edge. Every pause felt slightly rehearsed. And beneath all of it, Madison was watching more closely than before. She was no longer just leading the table. She was tracking it, measuring responses, looking for signs of influence slipping away. That was when she made her second mistake. She tried to isolate Nia inside the group dynamic instead of outside it. A subtle shift in tone. A shared joke that excluded Nia just slightly too deliberately. A question directed to everyone except her. It was small, but it was visible. And visibility is what kills subtle control. One of the girls laughed, then stopped halfway. Another didn't react at all. Nia didn't respond either. She simply observed the pattern forming. Madison noticed the lack of reaction again. That was becoming the pattern she hated most. No emotional leakage. No predictable response. Nothing to anchor her control to. So she adjusted again. Too quickly this time. "Nia's just quiet," Madison said lightly, as if explaining something to the table. "She's still getting used to us." There it was. Framing. Soft exclusion disguised as explanation. Nia looked at her for a moment. Not reacting immediately. Letting the sentence exist without interference. Then she spoke, voice calm. "I don't think I'm the one adjusting." The table went quiet. Not fully. But enough. Madison smiled immediately. But this time, it didn't arrive cleanly. It arrived as repair. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly, laughing just slightly too early. "I just meant." She stopped herself. And in that pause, something shifted again. Because now the table had seen it twice. Not conflict. Pattern. And once people start recognizing pattern instead of performance, control starts to erode faster than it can be rebuilt. Madison didn't lose control all at once. It never happens that way when someone is good at holding it. It slips in stages. Quiet enough that you can still pretend you're fine. Small enough that only you notice it first. But once you notice it, everything becomes harder to ignore. After lunch, she was quieter than usual. Not visibly disturbed, not openly reactive, but internally recalibrating. That was what Nia saw when Madison passed her in the hallway later that day. The smile was still there, of course. The posture still perfect. The social presence still intact. But the timing had changed slightly. The confidence in her movement had developed a fractional hesitation, like someone adjusting their steps on a surface they used to know by heart. Nia didn't acknowledge her, not as a strategy, as a response to information. Because once a system starts adjusting itself around you, acknowledging it too early gives it a chance to reassert structure. By the next practice, Madison had shifted tactics again. It was subtle, but deliberate. The warmth was back, even more than before. Too much. Compliments came faster. Smiles lasted longer. Corrections were softened or redirected. The room was being reassured constantly that nothing was wrong. That everything was normal. That whatever tension had briefly existed was just misunderstanding. But overcorrection is always its own form of exposure. Because people only try that hard to restore something when they believe it is slipping. Nia felt it in the way the other girls responded differently now. Not fully aligned with Madison. Not fully aligned with her. Suspended in between. Watching both. That was the most unstable position a group could be in. Madison tried to tighten it. She assigned formations more strictly. She corrected spacing more frequently. She increased praise in public and reduced it in private, trying to re-anchor loyalty through visibility. But the more she worked to reinforce structure, the more obvious it became that structure was something she was actively maintaining rather than something that existed naturally. And that distinction changes everything in groups like this. Because people will follow confidence. But they hesitate around effort. Effort implies resistance. Resistance implies instability. Instability implies opportunity. By mid-practice, something had clearly changed in Madison's approach. She was watching Nia more directly now. Not casually. Intentionally. Waiting for reaction points. Looking for openings. Trying to catch something she could use to reset the narrative. But Nia didn't give her any. No emotional spikes. No visible frustration. No compliance that could be reframed as weakness. Just consistent calm. And calm, when it refuses to break, becomes its own kind of pressure. At one point, during a transition drill, Madison stepped in slightly too close during a correction. Her voice stayed sweet, but the words were sharper than before. "You're still not syncing with the group," she said, loud enough for others to hear. A few girls looked over. Waiting. Nia adjusted her stance without rushing. "I am," she replied. Simple. Direct. No justification. That should have ended it. But Madison didn't let it. She smiled wider, as if amused. "That's not how it looks from here." And there it was again. Public framing. turning perception into authority. Nia paused for half a beat. Then said calmly, "Then maybe you're looking at the wrong thing." The air shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. A few girls glanced at Madison now instead of Nia. That was new. Madison felt it immediately. Because now she wasn't just managing a group. She was competing for interpretation. And interpretation is harder to control than behavior. The rest of practice went on, but something had already been introduced into the room that couldn't be removed easily. Uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It just makes people less committed to the version of reality they were holding before. By the time practice ended, the girls were leaving in smaller groups than usual. Conversations were less cohesive, laughter less synchronized. The social center of gravity that usually orbited Madison felt slightly less stable, like a system that still functioned but required more conscious effort to maintain balance. Madison stayed behind longer than the others, watching Nia pack her things. Waiting. When the room was nearly empty, she finally spoke. Her voice was quieter now. Not softer. More controlled. "You're not easy to read," she said. Nia didn't look up immediately. Then she did. "I'm not trying to be read," she replied. A pause. Madison nodded slowly, as if accepting something she didn't like but couldn't ignore anymore. "That might be the problem," she said. And for the first time since Nia arrived at Westbrook, Madison's smile didn't fully hide what was behind it. Not anger. Not confidence. Something far more dangerous. A decision forming. Madison didn't make her next move immediately. That was the first sign it was no longer improvisation. It had become planning. And planning is always more dangerous than reaction, because reaction still belongs to emotion. Planning belongs to intent. For 2 days after practice, nothing obvious happened. Which, in a place like Westbrook, was never a good sign. Because silence was not absence of action. It was preparation. Nia felt it in the shift of atmosphere before she ever saw it expressed. The way conversations near her paused half a beat longer than necessary. The way people looked at her and then away a fraction too quickly. The way Madison's presence became slightly less frequent in direct contact but more present in indirect spaces. Watching without being seen watching. That was the real transition. Madison had stopped engaging Nia directly as often. Instead, she was working around her. Through others. Through structure. Through social alignment. By the third day, small changes began appearing in the environment. Nothing that could be proven. Nothing that could be reported. But enough to accumulate meaning. A partner switch during practice that didn't need to happen. A formation adjustment that subtly placed Nia on the edge instead of the center. A correction given to her more sharply than to others for the same mistake. Each individual moment was defensible. Together, they formed intention. And intention is what creates pressure without confrontation. Nia didn't resist any of it. Not yet. Because resistance only matters when it interrupts strategy. Right now, she was still observing the shape of it. Trying to understand how Madison was rebuilding control without exposing herself. The answer came on Friday. Indirectly. During practice, Madison announced a team bonding exercise for the following week. Her tone was light, casual, almost playful, but the structure underneath it was already forming. Small group assignments, rotating leadership roles, informal evaluations, nothing official enough to question, everything structured enough to influence perception. Nia listened without reacting, because she recognized what this was immediately. It wasn't bonding, it was redistribution. Madison was rebuilding hierarchy in a controlled environment where she could watch reactions without appearing to intervene. That evening, as the others discussed it excitedly, Nia noticed something else. The girls weren't just participating in the idea. They were already aligning themselves within it. Deciding roles. Forming expectations. Positioning themselves socially before it even began. That was Madison's real strength. She didn't need to enforce control. She only needed to design situations where people would enforce it on each other. And by Monday, the system was already self-organizing. When the bonding exercises began, Madison barely needed to speak. She assigned groups once, then observed, and the groups adjusted themselves accordingly. Who led? Who followed? Who spoke? Who didn't? It all happened naturally enough that no one questioned whether it was natural at all. Except Nia, because she could see the pattern behind the randomness. Every grouping placed her in positions that required constant adjustment. Never openly hostile, never directly isolating, just slightly misaligned, just inconvenient enough to create friction without conflict. And friction, repeated often enough, becomes fatigue. That was the goal, to make her tired of resisting something that didn't look like resistance. By mid-session, Madison finally approached her directly. Not casually this time, not warmly, but with the same calm control she used when she wanted something to feel official without making it formal. "You're good at adapting," she said. Nia looked at her. "So are you." A brief pause. Madison smiled, but this time it didn't carry ease. It carried measurement again. "I think you misunderstand what this is," Madison said quietly. Nia held her gaze. "I don't think I do." That was enough. Because Madison didn't respond immediately. She just studied her for a moment longer than necessary. And then nodded slightly. Not agreement. Confirmation. Like something had just been verified. When she turned away, Nia understood something important had changed. This was no longer about social positioning. It had become containment. Madison was no longer trying to define her inside the group. She was trying to limit what she could become inside it. And that meant the next move would not be subtle anymore. It would be structured. And once structure replaces spontaneity in conflict, the outcome stops being unpredictable. It starts becoming inevitable. By the time the week ended, Nia could feel it clearly now. Madison was no longer experimenting. She was executing. The difference was subtle in appearance, but absolute in intention. Experimentation still carries hesitation, a willingness to adjust if something fails. Execution assumes the outcome has already been decided and only the method needs to be refined. And Madison had reached that point. The bonding system had quietly evolved into something more structured than anyone initially realized. What had been framed as team building now functioned like an ongoing social map. Each interaction, each group rotation, each assigned pairing was becoming data in Madison's head. Who aligned with whom, who followed direction easily, who questioned, who hesitated, who observed too much. And at the center of it all, Nia remained the only variable that refused to stabilize. That was what made her dangerous in Madison's eyes. Not defiance. Unpredictability. Because defiance can be punished. Unpredictability must be contained. By Monday, subtle pressure returned, but differently than before. There were no more small jokes aimed at her directly. No obvious corrections. No visible exclusion. Instead, there was structure. Too much structure. Assignments that kept shifting her. Placement. Rotations that never settled long enough to build consistency. Conversations that kept redirecting away from her input without openly dismissing it. Every interaction was engineered to prevent her from forming a stable role inside the group. It was elegant, and it was intentional. Nia recognized the strategy immediately. This was not social bullying anymore. It was controlled instability. If they couldn't define her negatively, they would prevent her from being defined at all. Because in systems like Westbrook, identity is not something you own. It is something the group agrees to allow you to have. And Madison was slowly withdrawing that permission. The others didn't fully understand it yet. They just felt something was off. Conversations didn't flow the same way when Nia was present. Decisions felt slightly delayed. Energy felt slightly split. People began compensating without realizing they were compensating. Laughing a little louder in her presence. Agreeing a little faster. Avoiding pauses that might create space for her to speak first. It wasn't hostility. It was adjustment. And adjustment is what happens when influence is being redistributed in real time. By Wednesday, even Madison's tone had shifted again. Not openly aggressive, not warm either. Neutral in appearance, but sharper underneath. "You're observant," she said during practice, almost casually, as if it were an offhand compliment. Nia didn't respond immediately. She waited, because she could feel the structure behind the sentence. When Nia finally spoke, her voice was calm. "You notice that now?" A small silence followed. Not long, but enough to register. Madison smiled faintly. "I always noticed." That was the first time it sounded less like confidence, and more like defense. The room didn't react, but something in the dynamic tightened slightly. A few girls glanced between them, unsure whether this was a conversation or something else disguised as one. Madison moved on quickly, directing attention elsewhere, but Nia saw it clearly now. Madison was trying to keep the system from acknowledging the shift. Because the moment the group acknowledged it, it would become real. And by Friday, it did. It happened during a routine practice rotation. Nothing dramatic, nothing visibly confrontational, just a moment of misalignment that the system couldn't absorb cleanly anymore. Nia corrected a sequence that another girl had performed incorrectly, but Madison's response came half a second too slow. Not incorrect, not absent, just delayed. And that delay was enough. Because now people were noticing timing. Not just instruction, not just authority. Timing. Who responded first? Who confirmed second? Who validated what? The invisible hierarchy that had always existed but never needed to be examined was suddenly being observed in real time. And once hierarchy is observed, it stops being automatic. Madison felt it immediately. Her smile returned, but slightly tighter. Her voice slightly brighter. Her corrections slightly more frequent. She was trying to restore flow. But flow had already been interrupted. After practice, as people left in smaller, quieter groups again, Madison stayed behind longer than usual. Nia noticed. She always noticed now. When the room emptied, Madison finally spoke. Not as captain, not as leader, just directly. "You're changing the room," she said. Nia looked at her calmly. "No," she replied. "I'm just not participating in how it used to work." A pause. Longer this time. Madison studied her carefully, as if deciding something that had been forming for days but only now had enough clarity to act on. Then she nodded once. Slow. Controlled. "Then we'll change how it works," she said quietly. And for the first time, there was no performance in her voice at all. Madison's words didn't sound like a threat when she said them. And that was exactly what made them dangerous. Because threats depend on emotion, on urgency, on visible intent. But what Madison offered was something colder than that. A shift in system design. A quiet acknowledgement that if one structure wasn't holding, she would simply build another. Nia understood that immediately. This wasn't escalation anymore. It was redesign. By the following Monday, Westbrook didn't feel different in obvious ways. It felt reorganized. Subtle adjustments had been made across the squad and, quietly, across the school's social rhythm. People weren't treating Nia worse or better in any direct sense. They were treating her differently in distribution. Attention was no longer consistent. Reactions no longer predictable. Conversations no longer anchored around a shared understanding of her place. Instead, she was being repositioned. Constantly. Without ever being told why. One moment she would be included naturally. The next, spoken over. Then addressed directly again as if nothing had happened. It created a psychological inconsistency that most people wouldn't consciously notice, but they would feel it. And feeling uncertainty is always the first step toward social isolation, even when no one intends it directly. Madison had refined the strategy. Instead of pushing Nia out, she was dissolving the space around her. Not rejection, displacement. And displacement is harder to resist because there is no single moment you can point to and say, "This is where it began." By midweek, Even the other girls began adapting to the new structure without realizing they were doing it. They corrected themselves more quickly around Madison, spoke less impulsively when Nia was present, waited for cues that didn't used to be necessary. The system was teaching them again how to move, and Nia could see it clearly now. Madison wasn't trying to break her anymore. She was trying to make her irrelevant without ever naming her as the cause. That required something more sophisticated than bullying. It required control over attention itself, the most valuable currency in any social environment. During practice that Wednesday, Madison barely interacted with Nia directly at all. That was intentional. She spoke around her, through her, near her, but never to her unless necessary. Instead, she redirected focus constantly to others, praising small improvements, highlighting mistakes, reinforcing structure across the group as a whole. It made Nia feel less like a target, and more like a missing variable. And missing variables are what systems try hardest to eliminate. At one point, during a rotation, Nia adjusted a formation instinctively when someone beside her faltered. It was correct, clean, natural, but Madison did not acknowledge it. Instead, she corrected another girl nearby for a much smaller mistake. Not because it mattered more, but because it mattered socially more. The message wasn't about accuracy. It was about direction of attention. Who gets validated? Who gets ignored? Who gets reinforced? Nia stopped moving for half a beat, just long enough to observe it fully. And in that moment, she realized something important. Madison wasn't just controlling behavior anymore. She was controlling perception of contribution. That was the next level. And it was far more stable than confrontation. Because if you can control what people think is valuable, you don't need to fight anyone directly. After practice, the girls filtered out as usual, but the spacing between them had changed again. Not dramatically, just enough to feel like invisible lines had been redrawn. Madison stayed behind first, then Nia. Then, finally, the room emptied. When it was just them again, Madison didn't immediately speak. She adjusted her bag, looked over the empty gym, then finally turned. "You're not responding the way I expected," she said. Nia met her gaze. "Maybe you expected the wrong thing." A pause. Madison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "That's the problem," she said quietly. "You keep acting like this is about you." Nia didn't answer immediately, because that was the first statement Madison had made that wasn't meant to provoke. It was meant to define. And definition is always the beginning of final decisions. When Nia finally spoke, her voice was steady. "Then what is it about?" Madison smiled. But this time, there was nothing performative in it at all. "Control," she said simply. And for the first time since Nia arrived at Westbrook, the conflict stopped being social and started becoming strategic. Madison didn't wait for a response after saying it. She didn't need to. Because once the word control was spoken out loud, the conversation had already moved beyond politeness, beyond social framing, beyond anything that could be mistaken for casual interaction. Now it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement changes everything. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The empty gym carried the sound of distance more than silence, the faint echo of a place that had just stopped pretending to be neutral. Nia watched Madison carefully now, not as a peer, not as a teammate, but as something closer to what she actually was in this system. A designer of outcomes. Madison, in return, didn't look away. That mattered. People who are confident in misunderstanding you tend to avoid your eyes. People who are recalculating don't. Finally, Madison stepped closer, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with the calm precision of someone closing distance in a conversation they intend to finish on their terms. "This isn't personal," she said. Nia's response was immediate. It stopped being personal a while ago. That made Madison pause. Just slightly. Not emotionally. Strategically. Because that answer didn't resist the framing. It expanded it. Madison nodded once, as if accepting something inconvenient but workable. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." But Nia didn't agree. Understanding implied shared rules. And there were no shared rules here. Only competing systems. Madison began walking slowly toward the exit, assuming Nia would follow or disengage. Either outcome was acceptable. But Nia stayed where she was for a moment longer, watching the space Madison had just occupied. Because now the structure was visible. Not just social structure. Intent structure. Madison wasn't trying to exclude her anymore. She was trying to contain her influence within predictable boundaries. That was the real objective. Containment without confrontation. Control without visible force. And it was working on everyone else. The squad had already adjusted. Not because they were told to. Because they felt it. The redistribution of attention. The subtle recalibration of who got space and who got absorbed into background. The way interactions now passed through Madison's presence even when she wasn't speaking. That kind of control doesn't announce itself. It normalizes itself. By the time Nia left the gym, Madison was already outside with two of the other girls, laughing lightly about something unrelated, perfectly composed again. The performance was back, but now Nia could see the seams. The next day at school, those seams became easier to spot everywhere. Hallway conversations that slowed when she approached. Groups that subtly shifted formation as she passed. Teachers who didn't treat her differently, but seemed slightly more aware of her presence than before. It wasn't hostility. It was calibration. Westbrook was adjusting itself around a new variable. And Madison had successfully made sure she was the reference point for that adjustment. That afternoon, during practice, the final phase of Madison's strategy became visible. She didn't isolate Nia. She didn't confront her. She didn't even challenge her directly. Instead, she began reinforcing the group's independence from her. Compliments were redistributed more evenly. Attention was widened. Leadership moments were shared. The message was simple, even if unspoken. No single person matters here. And the more evenly attention was distributed, the less central Nia became in perception. It was elegant. Because it didn't remove her. It diluted her. And dilution is far harder to fight than exclusion. During a break, one of the girls approached Nia briefly, smiling. "You're actually really good," she said, almost like it was an accidental admission. Nia nodded. "So are you." The girl smiled, then hesitated slightly before walking away. That hesitation mattered. Because hesitation meant uncertainty. And uncertainty meant Madison's system wasn't fully sealed yet. But when Nia looked across the gym, Madison was already watching. Not reacting. Not interfering. Just observing. And this time, there was something different in her expression. Not frustration. Not confidence. Anticipation. Because systems don't only adjust to threats. Sometimes, they prepare to eliminate them entirely. And Nia could feel it now more clearly than ever. The conflict was no longer about who controlled the room. It was about who got to define what control even meant. Madison stopped trying to compete with Nia directly after that week. Not because she had lost interest. Because she had refined her objective. Direct competition implies equality of engagement. It means both sides are reacting to each other in real time, adjusting, escalating, responding. Madison no longer needed that. She had realized something more efficient. She didn't need to beat Nia in moments. She needed to outlast her in structure. And structure always wins when no one notices it tightening. By the following Monday, the shift was no longer subtle to Nia. It was systemic. She wasn't being excluded. She wasn't being targeted. She was being absorbed incorrectly. Her presence was acknowledged just enough to prevent visible isolation, but never fully integrated into any stable social position. Conversations included her briefly, then moved past her. Group dynamics formed around her, then reformed without her input ever anchoring anything. Even when she spoke, responses came slightly delayed, as if her words were being processed through an extra layer before reaching agreement or acknowledgement. It created a strange effect. She was present, but not centered. In any system, that is the most unstable position to occupy. And Madison knew it. She had engineered it carefully. At practice that week, Madison's behavior looked almost indifferent on the surface. She smiled when appropriate, corrected when necessary, praised when useful, but the emotional temperature she used to carry had been deliberately flattened. No spikes, no confrontations, no moments that could be framed as conflict. Instead, she enforced rhythm, predictable cycles, repetitive structure, rotation without deviation. It wasn't about dominance anymore. It was about conditioning, because repetition changes perception faster than confrontation ever could. Nia felt it in her body before she fully articulated it. In thought, the drills were no longer just drills. They were patterns, and the patterns were designed to reinforce specific social alignments while making those alignments feel natural. If Madison praised someone after a correction, that person became slightly more responsive to her voice. If she corrected someone in front of others, that person became slightly more cautious in future actions. If she ignored someone entirely, that person slowly began adjusting themselves without external prompting. It was behavioral conditioning disguised as routine. And it was working, not perfectly, but steadily. The most important part was that no one resisted it consciously. Because nothing about it looked like something worth resisting. Except Nia. She didn't resist it outwardly. That would have been too easy to counter. Instead, she observed it, tracked it, let it reveal itself through repetition. And what she saw was simple. Madison wasn't trying to push her out of the system. She was trying to make sure the system no longer needed to include her. That difference mattered a lot, because exclusion creates resistance. Irrelevance creates erosion. By midweek, even small things had shifted. When Nia corrected timing in a formation, acknowledgement came from different people than before. When she adjusted spacing, it was validated inconsistently. When she spoke, responses varied in speed depending on who she addressed. It wasn't rejection, it was redistribution of responsiveness. Madison had turned the group into a network where attention itself was no longer centralized. Which meant no single interaction carried weight long enough to stabilize Nia's presence socially. It was elegant and dangerous, because it didn't attack her directly. It made her influence non-repeatable. That afternoon, after practice ended, Madison approached her alone again. But this time, there was no attempt at warmth. No social framing. No performance. Just clarity. You're still trying to engage it like it's about interaction, Madison said calmly. Nia met her eyes. It is interaction. Madison nodded once. It used to be. A pause. Then she added, almost softly. Now it's structure. That was the first time Nia understood the full shape of what Madison had built. Not a rivalry. Not a conflict. A system that no longer required emotional input to maintain control. And once a system reaches that stage, it stops reacting to individuals. It starts absorbing them. Nia looked at her for a long moment, then spoke quietly. And what happens when structure meets something it can't absorb? Madison didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because for the first time, she was no longer fully certain she did. Madison didn't answer Nia's question immediately. And that silence mattered more than any response she could have given. Because confidence reacts quickly, certainty fills space. But hesitation, real hesitation, only appears when someone is forced to consider that their system might not be complete. Madison recovered quickly, of course. People like her always do. But Nia had already seen it. A fraction of uncertainty. Just enough to confirm something important. Madison's structure was strong, but it wasn't finished. The next phase began quietly. Not through direct interaction, not through confrontation, but through environment. By the end of the week, the way Nia moved through Westbrook felt subtly different again. Not in obvious exclusion, not in hostility, but in spacing, in timing, in responsiveness. People didn't avoid her, they adjusted around her. Conversations formed slightly further away than before. Group clusters shifted before she reached them instead of during. Even casual acknowledgments came with a fraction of delay, as if people were waiting, without realizing they were waiting, for confirmation of how to treat her presence. It was no longer about Madison directly controlling interactions. It was about conditioning the group to treat Nia as an undefined variable. And undefined variables are always the first to be isolated by systems trying to stabilize themselves. Nia could see the logic now more clearly than ever. Madison had stopped trying to win attention. She was regulating its flow. If Nia spoke, the response would no longer be immediate or uniform. If she acted, the recognition would vary depending on proximity to Madison's influence. If she contributed, the weight of that contribution would depend on whether it aligned with the structure being reinforced that week. It was subtle, but consistent, and consistency is what turns manipulation into system design. At practice, Madison rarely addressed Nia directly anymore. Instead, she spoke to the group about standards, about consistency, about team cohesion, words that sounded neutral but functioned as control parameters. She praised alignment, she corrected deviation, she reinforced predictability, and slowly, without ever naming Nia, she made unpredictability socially expensive. The others adapted faster than they realized. They always do. A glance before responding, a pause before acknowledging, a quick check of the group before validating anything she said. No one told them to do this. They just learned it. Because social systems teach behavior faster than authority ever could. By midweek, something new appeared. Not exclusion, not hostility, distance. Nia was still included in everything. But she was no longer anchoring anything. She was orbiting the structure instead of being part of its center of gravity. And that was exactly what Madison wanted. Because once a person stops anchoring the group, they stop shaping it. And once they stop shaping it, they become easy to contain without resistance. That afternoon, after practice, the room emptied faster than usual. Not because anyone was told to leave, but because the rhythm had already been set. People moved when the structure signaled closure, not when conversation ended. Nia stayed behind slightly longer, as she always did, and Madison did too. They were alone again. But this time, the silence between them felt different. Heavier. More defined. Madison leaned against the edge of the bleachers, arms folded, watching Nia with an expression that no longer needed warmth to function. "You've noticed it," she said. It wasn't a question. Nia nodded once. "Yes." A pause. Madison exhaled slowly, almost thoughtfully. "That's the thing about systems," she said. "They don't need everyone to agree. They just need enough people to stop questioning the direction they're moving in." Nia met her gaze. "And when someone still questions it?" Madison tilted her head slightly. "Then they're either corrected," she said calmly, "or isolated by function." That wasn't a threat. It was an explanation. And explanations like that are always more serious than threats. Nia looked at her for a long moment. Then spoke quietly. "You're trying to make me irrelevant without removing me." Madison didn't deny it, which was the answer. Instead, she smiled faintly. "It's more stable that way," she said. A pause. Then, almost gently, "And harder to fight." For the first time, the conflict was no longer hidden beneath social behavior. It was fully visible now. Not as chaos, but as architecture. And once you see architecture, you start to understand where it can collapse. Madison's last sentence lingered longer than it should have. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate. And harder to fight. That was the part Nia kept turning over in her mind as she walked out of the gym that evening. Not as fear, not as uncertainty, but as confirmation of scale. Madison wasn't improvising anymore. She wasn't reacting to Nia's presence inside the system. She had built something that could operate without needing constant enforcement. That was the real difference now. And systems like that don't collapse from confrontation. They collapse from misalignment. The next few days didn't bring anything loud. Which, in itself, was the warning. At Westbrook, silence was never neutral. It was maintenance. Madison had fully transitioned into what Nia could only describe now as structural leadership. She no longer needed to directly manage behavior in real time. Instead, she had created conditions where behavior managed itself. It showed in small ways first. Girls correcting themselves before Madison even looked their way. Pausing mid-action when unsure, then adjusting to match group rhythm. Laughing slightly softer when Nia spoke, even when nothing she said was unusual. None of it was explicit. None of it was commanded. But all of it was aligned. And alignment, once internalized, is far more powerful than instruction. Nia observed it carefully, because this was the phase most people missed in systems like this. The point where control stops looking like control and starts looking like normality. By midweek, even the perception of Nia's role had changed again. Not negatively, not positively, but ambiguously. And ambiguity is where influence gets diluted without resistance. When she spoke, responses varied depending on who was closest to Madison. When she corrected something, acceptance came inconsistently, as if validation itself required permission from an unseen source. When she contributed in group formation, the weight of her input depended on proximity rather than merit. The structure had developed layers. And Nia was no longer interacting with a single system. She was interacting with a filtered one. Madison at the center. Everything else distributed outward. At practice, Madison's presence remained calm, almost distant now. But it was a controlled distance. Not disengagement. Delegation. She would say less, but her words carried more weight. Not because of volume or emotion, but because the group had learned to interpret her silence as directional input. That was the most advanced form of control she had built so far. When authority no longer needs expression to function. During a drill later that week, Nia adjusted a sequence cleanly, instinctively correcting a misalignment in timing that others had missed. It was precise, efficient, undeniably correct. But the response was different now. Not wrong, not dismissed, just delayed. A pause before acknowledgement, a hesitation before validation. Then, finally, agreement, but routed through someone closer to Madison. It wasn't about accuracy anymore. It was about authorization. Nia exhaled slowly. So that's what she built, she thought. A system where correctness still exists. But meaning depends on approval. After practice ended, the gym emptied in the usual structured flow. No urgency, no disorder, just quiet, predictable movement outward. Nia stayed behind longer than most. So did Madison. They didn't speak immediately. The silence between them now had a different quality. Not tension, compression, as if the space itself was being evaluated. Finally, Madison spoke. "You're adapting," she said. Nia looked at her. "So are you." A faint smile from Madison, but it didn't carry warmth anymore. "Just recognition. I don't need to adapt," Madison replied. "I just need the system to stay stable." Nia nodded slightly. "At my expense." Madison didn't correct her. And that was new. Instead, she stepped forward slightly, not invading space, but narrowing it. "You keep thinking this is about removing you," she said quietly. "It isn't." Nia held her gaze. Madison continued. "It's about making sure nothing depends on you in a way that can't be controlled." A pause. Then, softer. "And right now, people are still checking you." That was the real statement. Not accusation. Diagnosis. Nia understood immediately. As long as people still paused to evaluate her independently, the system wasn't complete. Madison wasn't trying to erase her presence. She was trying to remove her dependency value. To make her irrelevant not socially, but structurally. Nia finally spoke, voice even. And if I don't let that happen? Madison smiled faintly. For the first time in days, it looked almost honest. Then we find out how long structure holds, she said. And this time, there was no ambiguity in her tone at all. Only certainty about the next phase. Madison's certainty didn't feel like confidence anymore. It felt like commitment. And commitment, in systems like this, is where things stop being reversible. For the first time since this started, Nia stopped viewing Madison's actions as isolated strategies and started seeing them as a sequence. A chain, each adjustment feeding into the next. Each social correction reinforcing the last. Each subtle shift tightening the same outcome in smaller increments. It wasn't just control anymore. It was convergence. By the following Monday, the atmosphere at Westbrook had settled into something that no longer felt like conflict between two individuals. It felt like a new normal trying to establish itself. And the most dangerous part of that kind of transition is how quickly people adapt to it without realizing they've stopped remembering what came before. Madison had succeeded in something very specific. She had made Nia's presence no longer disruptive. Not because she was removed, but because the system had learned how to absorb her without reacting visibly. That was the goal, not elimination. Normalization under constraint. Nia saw it clearly now in how the squad functioned. When she spoke, responses were no longer hesitant, but routed. Filtered through established patterns. Validated indirectly instead of directly. Acknowledgement no longer belonged to individuals. It belonged to structure. And structure always answers through hierarchy. Madison rarely intervened now during practice. She didn't need to. Her presence alone regulated behavior. A glance replaced correction. A pause replaced instruction. A subtle shift in tone replaced enforcement. And everyone responded accordingly without conscious thought. That was the real evolution. Control without visible action. But something had changed underneath it. Nia could feel it every time she disrupted the rhythm, not intentionally, not loudly, just by existing outside the expected flow. There was a delay now. A brief hesitation in how the system processed her input. As if it had learned to classify her. But still wasn't fully sure how to resolve her. That uncertainty created friction inside the structure. And friction always accumulates. During practice that week, Madison tested something new. Not confrontation. Not exclusion. Replacement. When Nia corrected a timing issue in a formation, Madison immediately reinforced the same correction through another girl a moment later, but framed it as if it originated elsewhere. The result was subtle but significant. The group did not register Nia as the source of correction. They registered the validation source instead. That was a critical shift. Because influence is not just about being correct. It's about being recognized as the origin of correctness. Nia noticed immediately. Her correction had been absorbed, redistributed, and reattributed. Not denied. Not challenged. Reassigned. Madison had effectively rerouted attribution away from her. And attribution is where influence lives. After practice, the gym emptied in its usual controlled rhythm, but now something else lingered in the space. A sense that every interaction had been slightly pre-processed before it happened. Madison stayed behind again. So did Nia. This time, there was no silence between them that felt neutral. Everything now had structure inside it. Madison leaned lightly against the bleachers, watching her. "You see it now," she said. Nia nodded once. "You're controlling attribution." A faint smile crossed Madison's face. Not surprise. Confirmation. "Yes," she said simply. A pause. Then she added, "Because once people stop knowing where ideas come from, they stop attaching value to who had them first." That was the core of it. Not suppression. Displacement of origin. Nia studied her for a moment. Then spoke quietly. "You're building a system where I can still be right, but never be recognized as the reason." Madison tilted her head slightly. "That's one way to put it." Another pause. Then Madison stepped closer, not threatening, not aggressive, just closing distance like someone finalizing a design. But you should understand something, she said calmly. Nia didn't move. Madison continued. This only works if the system stays consistent. A beat. And consistency is expensive to maintain when the variable doesn't stabilize. That was the first time Madison said it without framing. Without performance. Without softness. Just mechanics. Nia finally understood what the next phase would be. Not escalation. Not confrontation. Stress testing. Because when a system cannot resolve a variable through adjustment, it eventually tries to determine whether the system itself can tolerate it. Madison looked at her for a moment longer. Then stepped back, not retreating, resetting distance. You're part of the structure now, she said quietly. A pause. And structures don't stay uncertain forever. Then she turned and left. And for the first time, Nia understood that this was no longer about influence inside Westbrook. It was about whether Westbrook itself would eventually decide she didn't belong inside its definition of stability at all. Madison's words didn't end the conversation. They ended the illusion that there would still be one. After that day, nothing at Westbrook changed suddenly. There was no visible shift, no dramatic moment that could be pointed to as the turning point. Instead, what changed was far more difficult to detect and far more difficult to stop. The system stopped treating Nia as a participant in real-time interactions and started treating her as a condition to be accounted for. That distinction changed everything. In practice, it showed up first as redundancy. When Nia made a correction, it was acknowledged, but immediately reinforced by someone else as if the validation needed duplication to be acceptable. When she adjusted timing, the group corrected itself again afterward as though her input had been absorbed but not credited. When she contributed during formations, her actions were no longer treated as originating decisions, but as coincidental alignment with group consensus. It was subtle, but consistent, and consistency is what turns social dynamics into structure. Madison was no longer competing with Nia for attention. She was regulating how attention processed her. Not by removing her voice, but by ensuring her voice never became the final reference point for anything. At first, Nia observed it clinically. The system wasn't rejecting her. It was absorbing her input and redistributing ownership of it. That was more advanced than simple exclusion. It was containment through diffusion. By midweek, the effect had become visible in group behavior itself. Girls no longer responded to her contributions directly unless prompted by proximity to Madison or reinforcement from someone higher in the informal hierarchy. Instead, they waited, not consciously, but structurally, waiting for confirmation pathways before acknowledging what they already understood. That delay created something new, a gap between action and recognition. And in that gap, influence weakens. Madison had essentially engineered a system where Nia could still be correct. But correctness had to travel through approval before becoming real. And approval always travels upward first, not outward. During practice that Thursday, Madison finally shifted the structure again. Not loudly, not obviously, but decisively. She introduced a new rotation rule. Leadership cues would now rotate more frequently, and corrections would be reinforced through peer validation before being acknowledged officially. On paper, it sounded fair. In practice, it redistributed authority even further away from individual influence and deeper into controlled consensus. It reduced the possibility of a single source stabilizing the group's interpretation of events. Which meant it reduced Nia's ability to anchor meaning in real time. That was intentional. Nia saw it immediately. This wasn't about fairness. It was about removing centrality. Because centrality is what allows individuals to disrupt systems. By the end of practice, the structure had stabilized again, but differently. More distributed, more controlled, less responsive to individual input. After everyone left, Madison stayed behind longer than usual. So did Nia. They didn't speak immediately. The space between them now felt less like tension and more like evaluation. Madison broke the silence first. You're adapting faster than expected, she said. Nia replied calmly, you're building faster than I'm reacting. A faint smile from Madison. But it didn't carry satisfaction. It carried acknowledgement. That's the point, she said. A pause. Then, more directly, I don't need to win interactions anymore. Nia watched her closely. Madison continued, I just need to make sure no interaction can depend on you to stabilize it. That was the full design now. Not removal. Not confrontation. Structural irrelevance. Nia finally spoke. And if I still affect the system? Madison didn't hesitate. Then the system tests how much pressure it can absorb before it reorganizes around you completely. A quiet moment followed. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just final in tone. Because now the conflict had moved beyond social positioning. It had moved into system endurance. And systems, unlike people, don't argue. They adapt. Or they fail. Madison turned slightly toward the exit, then paused just long enough to add one final thought. You're not being pushed out, she said calmly. You're being measured. Then she left. And for the first time since this began, Nia understood the real stakes were no longer about influence, reputation, or control inside Westbrook. They were about whether she could remain inside a system that was actively calculating how long it could function with her still inside it. The word measured didn't leave Nia's mind the entire night. It didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a countdown that had already started without asking for permission. The next morning, Westbrook didn't look different. But it functioned differently. That was the final stage Madison had been building toward all along. Not a visible shift in behavior, but a structural one in how behavior was interpreted. Nia noticed it immediately in the simplest places. A comment she made in passing during class was acknowledged, but redirected into group consensus before it could stand on its own. A correction she made in practice was accepted, but only after someone else repeated it first. Even neutral interactions carried a subtle delay now, as if the system needed to route her input through validation channels before allowing it to exist socially. It wasn't rejection, it was filtration. And filtration is what happens when a system decides it cannot afford unprocessed influence. By the time practice arrived that afternoon, the structure was fully in place. Madison was calm, too calm, not because she had stopped paying attention, because she no longer needed to respond in real time. Everything was already embedded. Rotations were assigned with built-in redundancy. Corrections required layered acknowledgement. Validation moved through multiple points before becoming socially active. It meant nothing Nia did could immediately stabilize around her presence anymore. Every action had to survive processing before it became real in the group. And that processing always moved away from her first. That was the final design. Nia understood it completely now. Madison wasn't trying to beat her. She was trying to make her presence structurally non-decisive. So even when she was right, she could no longer define what right meant in real time. During the final drills, Nia made one more adjustment in formation. Clean, correct, undeniable. But this time, something different happened. The group hesitated, not dramatically, not visibly, but collectively. A pause before alignment, a delay before acceptance. Then, instead of responding through the usual chain, the system stabilized around a different input. Not correction, but reinforcement from elsewhere. Madison didn't even look at her immediately. She didn't need to. The structure had already resolved it. And that was when Nia understood the final truth of what had been built. Madison had created a system where influence no longer belonged to individuals at all. It belonged to flow. And flow always moves away from resistance. After practice ended, the gym emptied in its usual quiet order. But this time, even the silence felt processed. Filtered. Pre-shaped. Madison stayed behind one last time. So did Nia. They stood at distance now. Not as opponents. Not as participants. But as two different understandings of the same system. Madison spoke first. Calm. Final. You're still thinking in terms of control, she said. Nia met her gaze. And you're still building systems that depend on removing it. A faint pause. Madison nodded slowly. No, she said. Then corrected herself. I'm building systems that don't need to recognize where control is coming from. Silence followed. Not heavy. Complete. Because there was nothing left to argue. Only architecture remaining. Nia finally spoke, voice steady. And what happens when something inside the system refuses to stop existing in a way that can't be filtered? Madison looked at her for a long moment. Not as a rival, not as a threat, but as a final variable. Then she answered quietly. Then the system decides what reality it can afford. A pause. Then she turned away. And this time, she didn't look back. Nia remained alone in the empty gym for a moment longer. Not defeated. Not victorious. Just aware. Because now she understood the truth that had been forming since the beginning. This was never about winning a social conflict. It was about whether a system could maintain stability when it could no longer fully define everything inside it. And somewhere in that realization, the outcome was already being decided. Not by force, not by confrontation, but by what the system would eventually choose to preserve, and what it would quietly allow to disappear.